Good afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council series, Election 2020, America's Role in the World. My name is Ian Brzezinski. I'm a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council and a co-convener of Elections 2020. This exciting new Atlantic Council series aims to highlight and explore the key national security issues that will define the agenda of the United States president, whoever that may be after the elections this November 3rd. Elections 2020 brings to our viewers a bipartisan, virtual stage featuring informative and in-depth conversations on key matters concerning America's role in the world. Among other subjects, we'll address the rise of China and great power competition, U.S. global defense strategy, cybersecurity, energy security, just to name a few. Elections 2020 draws on the most prominent voices and decision makers shaping the national conversation on these subjects to discuss and debate America's interests and leadership on the global stage. Last Monday, we launched with a lively discussion featuring former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Earlier today, we explored the future of cybersecurity with Jane Hall-Lute, a former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, and Michael Chertoff, former Secretary of Homeland Security. Tomorrow, we're hosting Jake Sullivan, a former Director of Policy Planning at the Department of State in the Obama administration, who is now a top advisor to Vice President Biden. This will be a fireside chat that addresses U.S. global leadership and strategy. We have more great events planned for the rest of the weeks of the Democratic and Republican conventions. Our viewers can find the latest lineup of speakers and sign up for each event on the Atlantic Council's website. Follow us on Twitter at Atlantic Council and engage in this important conversation using the hashtag ACElections2020. This afternoon, we have a fascinating panel on a very significant topic, the battle between democracy and authoritarianism. This is one of the defining geopolitical challenges of our time. This ideological contest is no less significant than it was during the Cold War, but today it is more complex and daunting amidst a technotronic age of rapidly evolving communications technologies. To address this subject, we have an outstanding panel. Ambassador Derek Mitchell currently serves as president of the National Democratic Institute, an institution that plays a critical role promoting democracy around the world. Previously, Derek served as U.S. Ambassador to Burma, the first ambassador of that country after a 22-year gap. Prior to that appointment, Derek served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. Ambassador Kurt Volker, who recently served as a U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. He also served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Kurt was a career Foreign Service officer who held senior positions in the Department of State, the National Security Council, and he served in Brussels at the NATO headquarters. He was a founding director of the McCain Institute, established in large part to promote freedom around the world. Our moderator today is Amy McKinnon, staff writer with Foreign Policy. Amy is an award-winning multimedia journalist. She's reported from Russia and from across Eastern Europe. For her documentary entitled Russia's Scapegoats, she received the prestigious Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Award. Her work has appeared in CNN, The Guardian, Business Leader, Slate, the Boston Globe, and many other places. So I turn the floor over to Amy. Amy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'm looking forward to getting stuck in on this very important and timely topic with Ambassadors Kurt Volker and Derek Mitchell. And I hope to lead our discussion today to focus on foreign policy and the role that the United States can play in supporting and strengthening democracy efforts around the world. But I do want to start with a question, which is it the intersection of domestic and foreign policy? And that is that, amidst fears right now of voter suppression, of images of Black Lives Matter protests being brutally dispersed in front of the White House, reports of politicization of intelligence in the United States, and public calls by the president from both the Chinese and the Russians to interfere in US elections. I think this may be a question for Ambassador Mitchell. What impact has this had on the US's standing as a credible promoter of democracy in the world? And what do future administrations do to move forward from this moment?
Well, first of all, thank you, Amy, for the question. I want to thank Ian Brzezinski for inviting me, and Colleen Bell and Paula Dobriansky, who are both organizers of this entire effort. They're two of the people that I admire as much as anyone in this town and anywhere. So thank you very much for the invitation. There's no doubt, first of all, America leads. America matters. America sends a signal to the world, and most of the world does look to the United States as a beacon of democracy. So when we fall short, we do, no doubt, I think, take the wind out of the sails of many around the world who may look to us for that leadership, who may look for models. So I don't think it's any secret, and I don't think it's partisan to say that American democracy is not well. The polarization is not healthy. The fact that we do have these mass movements is a sign of health. There's no doubt about that. The mass movements are not necessarily a negative thing. We have legacies in the United States that need to be addressed. And what's being shown daily in the streets and otherwise is that the energy of American democracy and of civic engagement is alive and well. That sends a very positive signal. But the ripple effects of signals that come from the US government over the past several years, the way media are portrayed, the way activities are done through the US government, and maybe even support for democracy overseas, it does have an impact. But one thing I'll say, and I hope we can discuss more about this, is that the world is still moving on. It does matter if they don't feel American winds behind them like they did before, but they're not focused on us while they focused on themselves. So you're still seeing this vast wave of popular demonstrations, movements for democracy, people all over the world saying, we want a voice, we want rights, we want justice. They are waiting for American support, but they're not waiting too long. They're taking this for themselves, and we should be right with them, regardless of the problems we have here at home.
What more needs to be done to prevent U.S. domestic policy, from undermining foreign policy messaging abroad, particularly on the question of democracy and human rights?
Well, I think you do have to send the signal from the very top that this matters, and then it ripples down through the entire government that this matters. I think demonstrating that, if we can find ways to work together, I think both parties in Washington, if we can talk to each other, not at each other, if we can talk through the media, not talk at the media, if we can show respect for civil society, all the elements of a strong democratic culture, which democracy is. It's not just a process, it's not just institutions among elites, it's an entire culture. And the culture in the United States is broken, that ability to have a conversation, to listen. Democracy is not just the right to speak, it's the responsibility to listen. And that culture is broken here too. So this is not simply a matter of who's in the White House. It's a matter of all the American people, what we can do together, and what we expect from our elected officials, and what kind of signal we send. So that's something everybody watching from the United States, we need to work on this. And we need to do this together, and then teach successive generations their rights and their responsibilities, so that once again we can be a beacon for those overseas who look to the United States for that kind of model and that kind of leadership.
Mm-hmm. I want to stay with you for one more moment, Ambassador Mitchell, and then I'll turn to Ambassador Volker, and who I want to discuss Russia with. But you mentioned earlier that, and as we've seen in Hong Kong, in Belarus, even as the US has been challenged of late, these democracy movements have persisted. But what role does it have if the US does take a step back in its perception in the world as a beacon of democracy, and somewhere for these countries that are yearning for better, yearning for democratization to look to?
Yeah, there's a vacuum. As I say, there's no substitute for American voice and American leadership. When we're not doing it, it's noticed. When we're not standing up for these values or representing those values, it's noticed. Clearly, it hasn't stopped the people of Belarus. It hasn't stopped the people of Hong Kong. And they still want to hear that voice. They want to know that they're not forgotten, that they're not alone. We need to be partnering with our allies. We need to get the EU to step up, and individual European nations. We need to get other democratic nations in Asia to recognize, as Ian Brzezinski said at the top, that this is really the defining issue of our time. And I'm sure we'll get to the issue of China. This isn't purely about China, but I think China does send a signal to us of what is at stake. That this is, and it's not just about democracy and democratic governance, but about democratic norms, norms of transparency, norms of accountability, norms of inclusion, norms of representation. This is what democracy is if you unpack it. And the question that we face in the next several decades and in this century is, what are those norms that will guide the international system in the coming years? It's up for grabs for the first time, at least since the Cold War, if not for 75 years. These institutions that we have established to give us some predictability and a lodestar for norms of holding everybody accountable, rule of law, being transparent, those are under threat. And we need to be galvanizing democratic nations to affirm those norms that work for the common interest globally and not just for the interest of a few autocratic or illiberal states.
Mm-hmm. So I want to turn now to talk about Russia, which suffered another slight today for its democratic leadership, as opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned very severely before boarding a flight to Tomsk. Earlier this month, a group of very prominent Russia experts published a piece in Politico saying that it was time to rethink the US's relationship with Russia, that the current mixture of sanctions and diplomacy just isn't working. And clearly something isn't working in our efforts to get along with Moscow. But Ambassador Volker, what were your thoughts about this call for another reset, and how should a future administration approach Moscow?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Amy. And let me first off just thank the Atlantic Council and Paula and Colleen and Ian Brzezinski, and it's great to be with you and great to be with Derek here as well. It's a great opportunity to discuss these issues. Second, I agree very much with a lot of what Derek said. I think he framed things very well about America's role in the world. One thing I would add to this, though, is that there is still more common ground between the political parties in the U.S. on basic foreign policy issues than there are differences. And our domestic political process, really, we're in the midst of an election 75 days away. And it's very much about the personality of the president and whether people support him or oppose him. And that disrupts everything else. But under the surface, I think you see a lot of agreement on issues like China, like trade, where we're very cautious right now, like Israel, the peace agreement or the mutual recognition with the UAE, like North Korea, like seeking a nuclear arrangement with Russia, having that extended, like Venezuela. There's just a lot of common ground there that is under the surface. And that comes to Russia, because Russia is also one where there's a lot of common ground. It's interesting what you bring up, and I'll fill in the viewers a little bit more. There was a very experienced and respected group, bipartisan, of Russia watchers, foreign policy experts, who wrote a piece in Politico arguing that it's time for a rethink. That was then followed a few days later by a rebuttal article, also on a bipartisan basis, which argued that no, it's not time for a rethink. It's time for Russia to rethink its policies of repression at home and aggression abroad. And then for advertising purposes, let me also say Foreign Policy was very kind to publish an article that I wrote also on that subject, where that was the concluding point that I made. It is not time for the West to rethink its policies. For once, it's time for Russia to rethink its policy. Now, let me go into that a little bit. Most of the time, President Trump, and therefore by default the Trump administration, is accused of covering up for Putin, not being willing to challenge Putin, call him out on things that he has done, whether it is paying a bounty to the Taliban to kill American soldiers, or the seizure of Crimea, or the continued fighting in Ukraine, or 12 years ago this month, the invasion of Georgia. Soft pedaling that is what the charge usually is. So it was very interesting to see this group of experts come out and essentially assert the administration is being too tough. And here I think the administration actually has been tough. It has had a policy of stronger sanctions against Russia. It has lifted the arms embargo against Ukraine, so that we are now supplying lethal defensive arms to the Ukrainians to help them protect their country against Russian aggression. And just this past week, Secretary Pompeo made some very strong statements about support for the people of Belarus, which Russia is now seeking to put down that uprising in Belarus. So I think there is a tough policy in place. At the same time, President Trump has tried to keep a door open to President Putin. That is essentially what the authors of this argument are arguing for, that they want to keep a door open to Russia, keep open the prospect of more dialogue, and that we should be rethinking our approach of these harsh measures. I fundamentally don't agree with that, though. My own view, and I signed the second of the letters and I wrote my own article, is that Russia is doing what it is doing for its own reasons. It's not acting as a response to US policy. They are repressing people at home in order to keep a small elite of former KGB people in power and in money. They are acting aggressively against their neighbors, like Georgia, like Moldova, like Ukraine, perhaps even this week, Belarus, as a way of keeping those countries from establishing successful democratic market systems and integrating into a Euro-Atlantic community. They want to continue to assert basically a Russian empire or a Russian dominance over their neighbors, echoing the Soviet Union, and to prevent these countries from realizing their own aspirations of being secure market democracies. Russia's going to continue to do that, and I think what is necessary is patience and persistence in US policy of pushing back on those forms of Russian malign behavior. And then to close, as I said, this is actually something where both parties agree. And if you look at votes in the Senate on sanctions against Russia, you can reliably get over 80 votes, most people from both parties, reliably in favor. If you look at support for Ukraine, you get reliably well over 80 votes in favor. The Georgia Support Act, same thing. So there is a great deal of bipartisan agreement on a firm and persistent policy in pushing back against Russian aggression, even as we speak.
Mm-hmm. So staying on Russia, or at least the broader region for a moment, I mean, I'm sure this is something you've heard in Ukraine from certain actors, Ambassador Volker, and I've certainly heard it as well from Russian officials and from groups who are opposed to the idea of Russia moving in the direction of a democracy, which is that the democracy, and particularly America's role in promoting it around the world, is often described almost as a dirty word. That, you know, their view being that, you know, America isn't doing this for the end of pursuing democracy in its own right, that this is somehow some nefarious plot. Often they rope in George Soros into these theories to push American influence in the world. How can future diplomats continue to support democratization efforts in these regions without provoking these kind of accusations? Or should we care about these kind of accusations at all? Or should we just say to hell with them and get on with it?
Right. One of the things that I learned as a diplomat and dealing with Russia is it's not as important to notice what they say, but to ask yourself, why are they saying it? America's support for democracy in the world is turned into an accusation of a way of, we want to sell American liquefied natural gas, or we want, contracts for US businesses, or we are trying to build an American hegemony and, tear countries away from Russia or encircle Russia. And you ask yourself, well, that's not true. You know that the people in all of these various countries, whether it's Georgia or Ukraine or Belarus today, are seeking American attention, seeking American support, visibility, connection, assistance, support for civil society, financing from organizations like DEREC's, NDI, and the National Endowment for Democracy. So that's what's really going on, and people know that. So why are Russia and opponents of America accusing us of something else? Because they see that it actually makes a difference. And they're afraid that if we are successful in supporting democracies in places like Ukraine, that becomes a message even for the Russian people that maybe one day they will be able to have a democracy in their country as well. So the advice I would have for the current and future generation of American diplomats is get used to the noise. Your opponents will make things up and accuse you of things, but stay focused on the North Star of what we are really trying to accomplish, and trust people. Trust the people of these countries that they know what their own identity is, what their own values are, what they seek for themselves and their future generations in those countries. the fundamental difference between the way the US and Russia approach these countries, like Ukraine or Georgia or others, is that the US aligns itself in supporting the aspirations of the people of the countries, where Russia aligns itself in trying to prevent the attainment of those aspirations.
Sorry, my headphones are connecting and disconnecting. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Someone nod. Wonderful. I want to put that question to Ambassador Mitchell as well, seeing as given your role with NDI.
Right. Well, look, a few things on that. As Ambassador Volker suggested, you have to get used to that among some more illiberal countries who see that democracy may not benefit them for whatever reason, or a free and open democratic society or a free election might not benefit them. So they will try and find an ulterior motive. The fact is that NDI and others, we work transparently. We don't go in and push our way in and work in the shadows. We go and talk to the government, we talk to civil society, we talk to legislatures, and we're very open about what we're about. We're about supporting the development of democratic processes, institutions, and mindsets, democratic culture in societies. And we're not interested in the outcome of their discussion or the outcome of their debates. We're not interested in the policies. We're simply interested in the process. I mean, that's very different than, say, what Russia does around the world, or what they assume about others, that they're seeking a particular outcome in certain policy issues. So, we have to recognize that some may project onto others, on the United States and us, an ulterior motive that they themselves may have. They can't imagine promoting these types of liberal values. They may disagree with some of the liberal values that we are seeking to support in the society. But as long as we are transparent and open and working with citizens of the country, I think we feel confident that we're doing the right thing. And that, in fact, in the end, the reason the United States does it is because it leads to better outcomes. I mean, you look at every study, you have better health outcomes, better education outcomes, better stability in societies. It's not an ideology. It actually works practically to build more stable societies and therefore more secure world, which is why we do it. And we should continue to have those conversations to try to convince and reassure what we're about. We're not out to subvert. But at a certain point, if some leaders like Putin and others, the liberals, don't get it, there's probably a reason why they don't get it. And we simply continue with our work because it's in our interest.
Before I continue, I want to remind the audience that you can send in your questions for the ambassadors using the Q&A box at the bottom on Zoom. And you can also use Twitter as well to send in your questions to the Atlantic Council. So I want to turn to China now. We're going to be hopping around the globe in this very short session that we have. The received wisdom for a very long time was that, with economic development would come greater calls for democratization, that a growing, wealthier middle class would push for democracy. And that was the received wisdom for a very long time. China has clearly upset that theory significantly. Given that China is now exporting its, tremendous financial and economic success around the world through the Belt and Road, how does that complicate US democracy promotion efforts in these countries where China is operating, such as Central Asia and now increasingly Africa? And that's for anyone who wants to jump in on that.
Well, it certainly has an impact. I guess I can start, if that's okay, Ambassador Volker. But there's no doubt it has impact. I mean, there are a number of illiberal states around the world, including Russia and Iran, and Saudi will do some of this to try to shape the way countries evolve politically for their own interests. And they have an interest in illiberal societies or corrupt elites or whatever it is for their own business or for their own geopolitical ends. China, though, is unique in the notion that they are really global and they have the resources and the will, it seems more and more, to try to shape a world that is illiberal. Whether it's exporting surveillance techniques and surveillance technology that they are testing in Xinjiang and testing on their own society. They have now surveillance in a box. They're sending all over the world, every continent, in Africa and in Latin America and in Asia and elsewhere. And that has impact on democratic development or ability free societies to develop freely and openly. They also, they in the way they do investment and they do aid, foreign aid, it is not transparent. It is not necessarily accountable to the parliament or to civil society or the people. So they're encouraging certain types of illiberalism and corruption that is not necessarily healthy. And just politically, they have been very open that they don't consider for themselves democracy and rule of law to be healthy for China. And they talk about exporting some values overseas. They just simply have a different ideology than we do about what makes for a stable world. So it definitely complicates. We have to be alert to this now as an NDI, certainly as the United States in a geopolitical sense. NDI is not geopolitical. We're just focused on supporting democratic norms and values. To the degree that what they are doing is shaping or perhaps working in opposition to what we are trying to support on the ground, we do have to be more alert to the way China does business, and we are becoming more alert to it. So far, we're not seeing huge impacts directly to our work. We're seeing it more in Asia and its periphery, but we do need to be awakened to this, because it will only get more severe and more challenging as time goes on and China gets more confident.
Yeah, Amy, if I could follow on.
Of course.
Just to say that I think we should look at this also in the context of history. I think Freedom House has been documenting a relative decline in freedom around the world over the last decade or 12 years or more. So this is a longer term trend. We've seen President Xi in China extend his rule for life. We've seen President Putin probably the same thing, 2036 anyway. We'll see how far that lasts for both him and for whether he needs an extension or not. And we've seen others increase authoritarian tendencies in various places in the world. This is already going on. Then you want to add to this the effects of COVID-19, where there has been a need for health reasons to increase controls and surveillance in society, which authoritarians have been far too happy to take advantage of in order to extend the way in which they're able to influence and control populations, not likely to be quickly reduced in a country like Russia or in China. Then you also have actions taken by many people under the cover of everyone being focused on the pandemic. We were talking earlier about the poisoning of Navalny today. You have the stealing of elections in Belarus. You have China's essential takeover of Hong Kong. You have China's militarization in the South China Sea. So you see a lot of things happening undercover here. And the final thing is that as we come out of a COVID-19 pandemic globally, what we're seeing is that democracies and market economies are going to be entering that period with high unemployment, weakened economies, and much greater national debt. So we will be coming at this from a position of relative weakness compared to where we were. And authoritarian countries like China, with state-owned enterprises like China, where they can direct national resources and engage in negotiated deals on a state-to-state basis, will come at this with a distinct advantage. And I therefore think that as we come out of this, we will need, as Derek was saying earlier, American leadership globally to try to pull a democratic and market-oriented world together so that we reinvest in the structures that make our kinds of societies successful, because we're going to be facing an even stiffer challenge from authoritarians and an illiberal economy going forward.
I mean, that just sounds like an impossible challenge to even begin with that, but best of luck. I'm glad I'm a journalist and not a diplomat.
Yeah, I'm just trying to say, I mean, it is a challenge, but look, there are a few things that are working on our side. First of all, we have to have the will. We have to be unapologetic about the importance of these values and these norms. Certainly there are different contexts and there are different cultures, but what we are seeing is not just increase in number of autocracies around the world, authoritarianism, decline in democracies, but we're also seeing, as I mentioned up front, this massive increase of popular unrest. I think it's like 44%, 45% of countries last year had major demonstrations. Now that's frustration with both democracies and non-democracies, but there's this crisis of governance. There's a frustration inchoate. But what it does tell you is that people are dissatisfied and they want to have a voice. They don't want less democracy, they want more. They just don't, they're just frustrated by the way it's worked for them. If it's usually it's not really a democracy, it could be a kind of hybrid system. But people are demanding a voice. New generations, it's led by young people, it's led by women, it's led by the marginalized. It's just a kind of sense that we're not going to take it anymore. And you saw it in Lebanon before what happened in the explosion a few weeks ago. And now you're seeing, of course, afterwards, you see in Belarus, you see it in Hong Kong. I mean, you could look at it, shake your heads and say, oh, this is too much. But in fact, the trends in a weird way are on the side of more of a voice and more democracy. But the challenge, as you say, is how do you take this inchoate frustration, which is driven by so many different drivers. It could be frustration over identity loss, insecurity, economic insecurity, corruption, poor governance, or all kinds of reasons behind it. But people are more and more expecting and demanding that they have a voice, and that's pure democracy. And what we need to figure out is how do we get new voices to step in, new generations of voices to step in, the older generations to step aside, which is harder to say in the United States now because we have at least at the top of the tickets, not newer generations. But so there's opportunity in the challenge of the moment. But certainly in an age of pandemic and the rest, it just compounds the issue.
I suppose rather than throwing up my hands and marveling at the challenge that this poses, a smarter question may have been, I mean, this sounds like an enormous task, more than one the United States could probably take on itself. I mean, what is the role of international institutions, be that the European Union, the United Nations, NATO, you name it, in helping to prevent this backsliding as a result of the pandemic and economic crisis? Maybe we can stay with you for that one, Ambassador Mitchell.
Oh, okay. Well, everyone's got to step up. I mean, this is a time where no one can just, when I mentioned America leads, I mean, America, it isn't the time where America is the hyperpower. It's over. I mean, it's a new age. And we need our allies more than ever, not just to be with us on the things that we do, but in cooperation, to do joint efforts. And they can't simply say, well, it's not our challenge, it's more something for the Americans to do. So there has to be first the will in the United States, the vision, and then the commitment to be working with others, with our allies, and the allies have to then step up. And we have to get engaged in these institutions. We've been pulling out of international institutions, and China has been moving in. And that's the UN at the macro level, it's WHO and others at other levels. We have to recognize that we're not engaged in the world simply because we're nice, and it's a good thing. We do it in our own interest, and that there is more and more at stake. And if anything the pandemic proves is that we are all connected, that we are only as secure as the least secure among us. It's sort of the paraphrase of Martin Luther King, who said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, or insecurity anywhere is a threat to security everywhere. It doesn't mean we're the world's policemen. We don't have those resources, but we have to set our priorities, provide leadership, provide vision, and then galvanize the international community to address what is now a global threat. We haven't seen the implications of the pandemic fully play out, the economic implications, the implications on societies, not just health. I mean, we're talking about governance. We still have climate change. We still have issues of transnational terrorism. I mean, we have to find a way to broaden this aperture, talk as a globe about these global threats, and not let anybody off the hook to be part of the solution. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to add a few thoughts to that as well. And I think the first and maybe the most important one is to recognize that not all international organizations are the same. And we have to think in terms of our values and like-minded countries versus those who don't share our values and who may in fact even be adversaries. So something like NATO, and Derek mentioned our allies, could not agree more. We should be reinforcing NATO. We should be working closely together with our European allies. I think we should be reviving US-EU relations as best we can. And even on a bilateral basis, some of the key allies where our relationships have frayed in recent years, we should be reinvesting in those, such as the US and Germany, US and France. So I think that's one thing. But take something like the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is stymied, ineffective, because Russia and China are adversaries. And so we're never going to see it play the role that the founders of the UN back in the 1940s had in mind, under a situation where you have two countries that do not share the purposes and principles of the UN Charter themselves. So that's going to be stuck. Then when you think about organizations, you think about, well, some are meant to be places where like-minded countries can gather and strategize and take concerted action. And NATO would be an example of that. The OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is meant to be an example of that. The World Trade Organization is meant to be an example of that, although it's been corrupted, if you will. It's been diluted in its focus on free trade principles by admitting countries that don't adhere to them and then not being able to enforce its own rules. Others are places where you don't agree with countries and you deliberately have a forum where you can have dialogue with those countries because you do disagree. And the UN fits that example. The OSCE in Europe fits that example. And I think we just need to have a clear sense of who we are and what we believe in and what we are trying to accomplish in the world. And then, as Derek said, engage. In some cases, it's going to be engaging with like-minded countries for real purposes of concerted action. In other countries, it's going to be engaging in dialogue and debate and parrying the efforts of those who would do things that we think are detrimental to our interests. But in either case, we need to be out there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we touched briefly on the Belt and Road earlier, and I want to turn now to look at Africa, where both Russia and China have made significant inroads in the past decade, and neither are expected to enhance the quality of democracy on the continent. I was reading on Monday that just in 2019 that Russian political specialists connected with Yevgeny Prigozhin were involved in, I think, around 20 elections on the continent just in the year of 2019. So not looking that they're going to be withdrawing from the region anytime soon. But I always feel like Russia and China pose different kinds of challenges to democracy. And so how would you, I'll open this out to both of you, how would you characterize the different impact they have on, fragile democracies abroad, and then what challenge does that pose both for US policy and international institutions working in the region?
Right. Well, where they're alike is they seem to appreciate elites and sort of encourage the corruption of the top. They're certainly not interested in the average voice. And when it comes to the Russians and providing hundreds of millions of dollars through finance vehicles to try to shape elections and sort of shape the debates in their direction. The selling of weapons. I mean, they're seeking to get investment opportunities. They're seeking to get resource access, similar to China. I mean, China's interested as well in the market. They're interested in, they've had a long-standing relationship with Africa. So they are, I think they have a much more full court press, and they've been there for a long time. And every year, the first visit by a Chinese foreign minister is to Africa to send a signal that Africa matters and that they're invested there, and they're the leader of the developing world, as it were. We need to be, I mean, what they do fundamentally, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of shape an illiberal environment. They're not interested in the free debate, the oversight, the accountability that's required for these stable societies, and it's extremely dangerous. On the other hand, I mean, we can't be completely geopolitical about this, because China does have resources, and they have resources that Africa needs. The United States can't fight something, or shouldn't try to fight something with nothing. I mean, we've contributed to health benefits. We do invest a lot in Africa, but we're not really there diplomatically. We don't send senior diplomats there. We don't give the attention. We don't show the real symbolic support that's required. But so I think we need to up our game. We need to demonstrate an alternative way of enabling them to get the infrastructure resources and the development aid, the investment that works for everyone there. And then, frankly, institutes like NDI, IRI, the NED we should be empowering citizens to be alert to what's happening to their countries from malign influence, or any foreign influence for that matter. Because what we are about fundamentally is that countries have control of their own sovereignty. We are empowering people to be able to see what their government is doing, and make sure that their government is responding to their needs and not others. It could be the United States, it could be Russia, it could be Iran, it could be Saudi, in essence. And I think that's what we seek to do in order for them to defend their sovereignty against what is an aggressive, in my view, a very aggressive push by Russia and China to kind of shape things toward their kind of illiberal interests rather than a broader sovereign interest of these countries.
Shall I add on, Amy, or do you want to move on?
If you want to, yes, absolutely. Before you do, I just want to remind people, I'm going to move to audience questions in just a moment. If people have any questions for the ambassadors, I encourage you to send them in using the Q&A chat box at the bottom. But anyway, Ambassador Volker, back to you.
All right, well, thank you. Well, a couple of thoughts on this in addition to what Derek said. One of them, the inroads that Russia, or especially China, have made in Africa are nothing compared to the inroads that Africans themselves have made in building their societies. Africa today is fundamentally miles ahead from where Africa was 30 years ago. In terms of education, in terms of development, in terms of globalization, in terms of access to job creation, it is a dynamic continent, and that's something the Africans themselves are doing. Secondly, I completely agree with Derek. China looks at Africa as a source of materials, of resources that it can have, and also cheap markets. And it really doesn't care about the development of the countries. It doesn't care about governance. In fact, the less engagement with that, the better. That is something that the African countries themselves understand and do not appreciate, but they do need the resources. And so it is not, China's not creating a set of allies. They are creating a set of commercial relationships. By contrast, when you look at what is probably having the biggest impact on Africa, over the past 2 decades and for the 2 decades to come, it's health and education. And that is where I think there's a lot of admiration for the United States and Europe, where people send their kids to college, where people are engaging especially in medicine and learning, where there are significant assistance programs to develop those countries in these particular areas. And I think that there actually is a sense where Europe and the United States are in many ways a model. And I know we promised to stay within the Hatch Act guidelines, so I'll be careful in how I do this. But when you look at a political party in the United States where you have a child of Jamaican and Tamil immigrants named to be the vice presidential candidate, and another party where the ambassador to the United Nations and potentially a future presidential candidate is the child of South Asian immigrants, that tells people something, that this is still a country that is dynamic, where there's democracy, where there's opportunity. And I think that still speaks to people in Africa. So I think we have a lot to compete on in other ways, in addition to the ways, beyond the ways that China's competing, just treating them as a marketplace. And the final point is I do want to give a shout out to the Development Finance Corporation. This has been a positive innovation in the past couple of years to reformulate Development Finance Corporation, increase its funding, and position it as more capable of competing with China or other sources of capital in places like Africa.
Yeah. So we have a questions coming from somebody in the audience on disinformation, and I think I'll stay with you for this one, Ambassador Volker. Michael asks, how do we counter disinformation and fake news and to keep publics accurately, truthfully informed without resorting to authoritarian tending tactics and measures? How do we avoid the temptation to lock down the media in the name of preventing hysteria and misinformation?
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think the most important thing that you can do to counter disinformation is to expose it. So when Russian military intelligence or when others are behind false information, or when information is promoted that is demonstrably false, or when you have state-run television propaganda such as RT or Sputnik or CGTN to expose what that is so that people understand it and can make their own judgments. I think countering or pushing propaganda just makes people suspicious of your own efforts as well. So I think it is actually using the language and the exposure and the transparency of free speech that actually is the best thing that you can do.
So when you say countering the misinformation, I mean, where do you think things like fact-checking services lie in this? Is that worth it, or are we just giving more airtime to the misinformation?
No, that's a good fact-checking, and there are a number of nonprofits that do this. That is a good example of exposure. You're taking false information, fake news, if you will, and showing what it is. The contrast would be if the U.S. government put together its own RT or its own Sputnik. There's a lot of debate now about the role of U.S. broadcasting, U.S. Agency for Global Media, and Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and so forth. To their credit, what these organizations do is provide a space for independent journalism and reliable news and information. If we were to turn that into a propaganda arm of the US government, I think that would diminish credibility and be a mistake. So preserving that space for genuine, impartial news while exposing the fake news is the way to go.
I mean, there have been significant efforts invested in fact-checking services, and I mean, even within the United States, I mean, there's no shortage of independent, highly credible, quality media. But still, I mean, we've certainly seen this with the pandemic. There just seems to be there's still awash with misinformation and disinformation. I mean, fact-checking and countering false narratives is one thing, but how do we stop people from being susceptible to disinformation and misinformation? And that's for either of you.
Eric, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I do completely agree with Ambassador Volker on the issue of transparency. I think it's two other components to this as well. One is, I think the digital platforms, social media platforms, do have a responsibility to label if it's clearly a bot-driven or disinformation from malign sources, that it's not organic. I agree, they shouldn't be in the business of judging facts all the time, what is a fact, what is not, but when it's clear disinformation and coordinated inauthentic activity, they have a responsibility to take it down if it's purely hateful, crosses certain lines, ethical lines, as well as label and note where it came from. Secondly, though, what we really need, I think, gets to your question, is not just the supply side, it's the demand side. Is how do we intake stuff? How do we read this stuff? There has to, ultimately, I don't think we can get out in front of this tsunami of stuff that's going to come in. We're never going to be able to get rid of all that. So it's going to be incumbent on all of us to be resilient to it, to somehow know how to read this, to be digitally literate, as the term is. But even more than that, to determine what it is that people need to understand about what they read and how they read things. That, I think, needs a lot more attention in the United States. So that, I mean, I'm still amazed. I was amazed when it was 15 years ago, and even more amazed today when people say, well, I read it on the internet. Well, how could it be wrong? What could go wrong? It's on the internet. I read it there. There has to be a way for, and this is what democracy is founded on. This is what Jefferson was about. He founded my alma mater, UVA, for that reason, for an educated population, so that we can make up our minds on our own to determine what is fact, what is not, and be responsible for ourselves. And ultimately, the problem with disinformation is that, or even anything that sounds right, that feels right, is that it appeals to your basest instinct. It's something you want to believe. And that's a human thing, unfortunately, that I don't know how you reverse entirely. People just have to be responsible, mindful, educated citizens, not just partisans, not just team players, where you're a Democrat or Republican, but you're an American first, saying we have to figure out what's right and wrong so we can have a debate on that basis. If you don't know what a fact is, you don't agree what the facts are, democracy honestly can't succeed. So at a certain level, this is existential, this whole question.
So we have another question from the audience, which is, how can the US respond to allies like Poland and Hungary who've seen their own democratic backsliding? Again, whoever wants to jump in on that.
Well, I'm happy to chime in on that, and Derek, I'm sure I'll say a few things that you'll want to nuance a bit. But my view on this, Derek mentioned earlier in the conversation that we are seeing mass protest movements and public disenfranchisement with governance all over the world. And we've seen this for years. And what I view as having happened is people have felt that the elites that govern, whether they're in democracies or in authoritarian states, have become detached from the population and don't feel that they're looking out for what the public perceives as its own interest. And this takes many forms. Brexit was partly about this. Immigration issues in Europe are largely about this. Immigration issues here are largely about this on the right. So what we see is an undercurrent, a broad swath of populations in almost every country where people feel that the elites don't get it. In some cases, they form political parties that are prominent but have not fundamentally taken power or changed the system. Take Italy, the Five-Star Movement, and the Liga. Or take the National Front in France, or the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. So these are all manifestations of similar things. In the case of Poland and Hungary, you have a majority of people who believe that they are not well understood and not protected, either by the preceding elites that were in power or by the European Union, which they view as favoring a liberal, politically liberal set of policies against what they feel are conservative and traditionalist policies. The name of the party in Poland is Law and Justice. So that's what they are seeking in their own societies. They can and do go too far sometimes. I testified in Congress once where I compared the Prime Minister of Hungary to a Chicago politician. He's just very good at being a tough politician. He just has a country instead of a city. And he has been able to run circles around the opposition. And as a result, he can get complacent, and I described him as boneheaded for some of the policies that he pursues. But that doesn't mean he's not a Democrat. They have democratic elections. He wins them because he is appealing to what the majority of the people want. And I think the challenge for us in the United States or friends in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe is to not see these countries as outside the norm of democracies, but rather to see them as grappling with the same problems that we're grappling with, which is how do we keep our publics identifying with the governing elite so that compact in society remains strong. It is happening in all of our countries, including in this one. And we've got to make sure that we are continually refreshing our democracy with political leaders that are able to engage with populations and lead them up rather than lead them down.
Yeah. No, I think Kurt is exactly right on all that. I don't disagree with it. We'll nuance it a little bit in a moment, but there's no doubt that you're seeing similar dynamics in the United States as you're seeing in, say, Poland and Turkey and Hungary in other places, in the sense of a rural-urban divide. If you saw the urban elections in Turkey and in Hungary and in Poland, it's gone towards sort of progressive candidates. And there's a massive progressive population that is gathered in the cities, and they're the ones driving it. But then a large group of people in the rural areas who feel, as Kurt said, left behind. They're getting in Poland, they're getting the benefits of largesse from the government and being kept going by money. And in Hungary and Poland as well, identity politics. Again, in the sense, it's an ideological thing where people feel insecure that they're losing something. They're losing some Polishness, Hungarianness that the democratic leader, who can be populist or demagogic, depending how you look at it, plays on. So you're seeing the rise of sort of anti-Semitism in Poland again, anti-LGBT, excuse me, and in Hungary, anti-immigrant, where they're not even immigrants. I mean, it's a populism that plays on people's general fear about new and progressive ideas. When that's not necessarily what they want, you're getting a vote. at least from the rural areas. At the same time, in a place like both Hungary and Poland, the concern is that they get elected democratically, but then when they're in, they start to chip away at the democratic institutions. And that's where it gets very dangerous, where it becomes democratic in form, but not in fact. And in Hungary, in Poland too, the media are being chipped away. It's not, they're not independent media, or at least, well, Poland has vibrant media, but the public media is not. Hungary is all the media being taken over by Orban people. Civil society is restricted. The judiciary is being packed. This is just textbook gradual authoritarianism, so that you have an election, but you have one, maybe two, and then it's basically controlled from there. And that's the worry. And in fact, I guess it was VDEM who called Hungary the first autocratic EU member. So that is where the worry comes, and these kinds of developments and dynamics are things we have to watch very closely.
If I could add just 2 quick points, Amy, I know we're wrapping up.
Sure. Quickly.
One of them is in the last round of elections held in Hungary, which were municipal elections. Fidesz got soundly beaten all over the country, urban areas as well as rural areas. So I think that there's still a competitive nature to democracy in Hungary. The second is, you make a good point about the media, and I just want to expand that point again because it's something we all have. I have a hard time watching cable news in either channel anymore because it just reeks with the politicization of information as opposed to just information. And I remember when Prime Minister Berlusconi was Prime Minister of Italy, you had state media in Italy and you had private media. But who was the owner of the private media? It was Berlusconi. And so we all face this issue of private ownership of media that has political views. Ukraine suffers from this as well. That's something I don't think we figured out. It used to be that the media was a more lucrative field of endeavor, and you had a variety of people who were doing it for media's sake. And now, where it's hard to make money in media because of digitalization, you find that the people who are willing to own media are the ones who are willing to put money into it because it serves a different purpose for them.
Yeah. So we're going to go to the speed round now. I have one question left from our host, Ian Brzezinski. Got 2 minutes left, so 1 minute each for this massive but very excellent forward-looking question. And that is that John McCain advocated strongly for a community of democracies to be established to protect and promote common interests and values. Is such a community acting in coordination to promote and protect democratic principles and practices possible? And if yet, what actions could it take? I'll put that to, let's stay with Ambassador Volker for that one.
And I'm going to apologize. Can you repeat the question again quickly?
Sure. John McCain advocated for a community of democracies. What would that look like and what action could it take?
Yeah, so I think we need to think in concentric circles. You have countries that have shared values and shared interests. And I think the US and our NATO allies fit that category. You have others that may be democracies where we have shared values. Chile, put that in the category there. South Korea or New Zealand, but they're not quite the same shared interests. So you can't mobilize a community like that like you can mobilize a community in NATO. I think it is valuable for the like-mindedness to engage with them and to talk about principles and values in societies. But I think when it comes to community democracies as an organization of advancing, promoting, and protecting democracy, I don't think the shared interests are tight enough to be able to mobilize a community like that.
Well, the community the community of democracies itself does exist. It was established by my chairman of NDI, Madeleine Albright, 20 years ago, as Ian well knows, and it was in Poland, I think, where they have its headquarters. This is a challenge. Even that community that institution has been challenged because people become members and come out of members. I think the membership issue is a problem because you just a sliding scale of democracy. What I think we need to do, as I mentioned earlier, you need to define it not in terms of democracies and who gets stamped with you are a democracy and you are in. It's who is willing to be with us on the democratic norms, who's willing to be with us on promoting in all aspects rule of law, not rule by law, but if maritime law, non-proliferation norms, transparency, accountability, inclusion, all these things, representation. And that can be, some of these countries don't necessarily have to be democracies. Some, they may just have common interests and common norms. We need to find those countries who believe this, because there's an illiberal tide that can shape in their image. And I think there are, as you say, concentric circles, as Kurt said. I think we can go about forming this, starting with the ones that are already there: NATO, our Asian allies, and like-mindeds around the world.
Well, we're bang on 4:01. So we're going to have to wrap it up there. But thank you so much, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Mitchell, for joining us today for this discussion with the Atlantic Council. And thank you to our audience for joining in and for sending your questions. And I'm going to leave it there. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.